Madam President. I've been called a lot of names in my life. Tammy, Lieutenant Colonel, Senator, and a couple others I shouldn't mention in polite company. Mommy, though, is without a doubt my favorite name. It's the one my 5-year-old uses when she runs into the house after dance class and poos on my sleeve, eager to show me what she learned during her lesson. It's the one my 9-year-old says when she announces her latest life plan. When she was little, she wanted to grow up to be a garbage collector. Now she's leaning towards being an Army cyber warrior. My girls are my everything. But they likely would never have been born if I hadn't had access to the basic reproductive rights that Americans, up until recently, had been depending on for nearly a half-century. Because after a decade struggling with infertility after my service in Iraq, I was only able to get pregnant through the miracle of IVF. IVF is the reason I get to experience the chaos and the beauty, the stress and the joy that is motherhood. IVF is the reason that my husband and I aren't just Tammy and Brian, but we're mom and dad. IVF made our family. It made my heart whole. It made my life full. But for countless women in Alabama, that desperately sought after dream of becoming a mom just became so much harder. Last week, that state's Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos created through IVF should be considered children under state law, a ruling that paints women like me and our doctors as criminals, and one that throws IVF access into chaos as countless women and doctors try to figure out whether they might be criminalized for simply trying to create a family. If you're thinking that this makes no sense, you're right. You're not misunderstanding anything. You're not missing something. It's the nightmarish blend of hypocrisy and misogyny that you think it is. The very people who claim to be defending family values are the ones trying to enact dystopian policies that would prevent Americans from starting their own families. This is no longer a hypothetical worst-case scenario. IVF providers around the state have already paused treatments out of fear that their doctors and patients could be punished. Organizations that transport embryos to and from medical facilities in Alabama have already announced that they'll stop doing so, meaning that would-be parents there won't even be able to start their families in any other states either. And now that the first domino has fallen, it seems like it could only be a matter of time before more hospitals and more organizations make the same call, before more state courts issue similar rulings, before more extremist politicians succeed in enacting even more draconian laws nationwide. Think about that. Think about what's at stake if state courts simply can strip away access to IVF. Think about how many would-be moms might never be able to hear their child's first little gurgle of a laugh. Think about how many hopeful dads might never be able to play tooth fairy when his would-be daughter loses her first tooth. You know, I lived in Alabama for a bit when I was in the Army, stationed at what's now called Fort Novosel. And I didn't know it at the time, but infertility would become one of the most heartbreaking struggles of my life. My miscarriage more painful than any wound I ever earned on the battlefield. I also almost lost the opportunity to even try IVF because a doctor at a well-known Catholic hospital that my VA hospital had referred me to told me I was simply too old for treatment, that at 42, I should just go home and enjoy my husband instead, and if it was meant to be, I would get pregnant. It was pure luck that I found out that doctor was lying to me, that she wasn't basing her advice on medical science, but rather on her personal religious beliefs, nearly costing me my chance to have my 2 little girls. So it's a little personal when a majority male state Supreme Court suggests that people like me who became parents with the help of modern medicine should be in jail cells and not nurseries. And I know I'm not the only one who struggles to understand how elected representatives who back these kinds of policies can call themselves members of the so-called party of life. No, rulings like this one and the bills with the same intent that are being pushed forward in state legislatures around the country are not about being pro-life. They're about catering to an extremist base by exerting even more control over women's bodies, inserting politicians into some of the most intimate personal decisions anyone could ever make. Look, back when I was going through IVF, 3 of my 5 fertilized eggs were deemed non-viable. If a version of this ruling had been in place then, I might have been forced to implant each of those 3 non-viable embryos. I might have been forced to suffer through 3 more miscarriages, or else risk me or my doctor being convicted of manslaughter for discarding non-viable fertilized eggs. That's the kind of extremism we're talking about here. That's the level of cruelty that we're facing. That's the kind of future we're fighting to prevent, where frozen embryos have more rights than the women who would carry them. Let's be clear about what led to this moment. The overturning of Roe is what made last week's ruling even possible, as it stripped women of a constitutional right, transferring the power to decide whether or when to start families from us to politicians in state houses across the country. Donald Trump is the one who brags about taking down Roe v. Wade. Donald Trump is the one who acts as if that's something to be proud of. So while it may now be convenient for him to claim that he had nothing to do with what happened in Alabama, we know the truth. IVF is at risk because of him. He is to blame, him and every other GOP official who shamelessly kisses his ring, proving with every word they say that they care more about protecting his poll numbers than protecting Americans' freedoms. After Roe v. Wade was overturned, actually, even before then, when the Senate was deciding whether to confirm Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, I warned that red states would come for IVF, and now they have. But they aren't going to stop in Alabama. Mark my words, if we do not act now, it will only get worse. There are a lot of nuanced, tough calls we must make as senators. This simply isn't one of them. We know what's right, even if extremist courts would like to rob millions of us of our rights. We shouldn't need to wait until women and doctors are thrown in jail before we act to protect them. That's why today I'm begging my colleagues to help me pass my Access to Family Building Act, a bill that would ensure that every American's right to become a parent via treatments like IVF is fully protected, regardless of what state they live in, helping guarantee that no hopeful parent or doctor in this country can be held criminally liable for starting or growing a family through IVF. The reality is, 1 in 4 married women have difficulty getting pregnant or carrying a pregnancy to term. That number doesn't even include partnerless Americans or other families also trying to have kids. That's 1 in 4 in red states and in blue states, in big cities and rural towns, in the wealthiest neighborhoods of the poorest and in the poorest of zip codes. Because infertility doesn't discriminate between party lines. It doesn't recognize state borders. No one should feel that someone else's religious beliefs or partisan slants could rob them of their chance to get pregnant. And no doctor should have to risk a criminal record just to provide women basic health care. So to my Republican colleagues, please think about how many that 1 in 4 equates to in your state. Women willing to go through expensive, painful medical treatments just for a chance to experience the smallest, most banal moments of parenthood. Just to have a newborn to swaddle, a baby whose diaper needs to be changed, a toddler who needs their shoes to be tied. And if you believe that they have the right to be called mom without also being called a criminal, then all you have to do to prove it is to let us pass this should be obvious legislation. Because in this nightmarish moment, it's nowhere near enough to send out a vaguely worded tweet claiming you care about women's rights, despite a voting record to the contrary. No, this is where the rubber meets the road. If you truly care about the sanctity of families, if you're genuinely, actually, honestly interested in protecting IVF, then you need to show it by not blocking this bill today. It's that simple. Thank you. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of S. 3612 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Mississippi.
Madam President, I support the ability for mothers and fathers to have total access to IVF in bringing new life into the world. I also believe human life should be protected. These are not mutually exclusive. Let's be clear about what the Alabama case is about. This was a case brought by families whose human embryos were killed when an unauthorized individual walked into the fertility clinic through an unsecured door, removed several human embryos, and dropped them, causing their deaths. The court's holding in favor of the parents found that these frozen human embryos are children under Alabama law. It did not ban IVF, nor has any state banned IVF. The bill before us today is a vast overreach that is full of poison pills that go way too far beyond ensuring legal access to IVF. The act explicitly waives the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and would subject religious and pro-life organizations to crippling lawsuits. Religious and pro-life organizations could be forced to facilitate procedures that violate their core beliefs, including their health insurance plans. This would be the first time the bipartisan Religious Freedom Restoration Act, introduced by then Representative Chuck Schumer, was explicitly waived. The bill's expansion definition of artificial reproductive technology sweeps in much more than IVF and has far-reaching implications. It would legalize human cloning. It would legalize commercial surrogacy, including for young girls without parental involvement. It would legalize gene-edited designer babies and lift the federal ban on the creation of 3-parent embryos. It would legalize the creation of human-animal chimeras. Other developed countries like Germany, New Zealand, and Australia, as well as states like Louisiana, have policies that allow for IVF coupled with common sense protections to respect human life. Creating rights to human cloning, the genetic engineering of human embryos, and surrogacy is too extreme and goes far beyond IVF. This bill misses the mark. We should strive to do both, and this bill does not do that. Therefore, I object.
Senator from Illinois.
President, I have the greatest respect and admiration for my friend from Mississippi, but I have to say that I disagree with her interpretation of my piece of legislation. This bill does 3 things and 3 things only. It protects the right of individuals to seek assistive reproductive technology without fear of being prosecuted for seeking that technology. It preserves the right of physicians to provide that assistive reproductive technology without fear of being prosecuted. And it also allows insurance companies to cover assistive reproductive technology. That is all that it does. It does not force anyone to seek reproductive technology. It does not force anyone to offer it. It does not force anyone to cover it. It simply says you have a statutory right, should you choose to pursue assistive reproductive technology, that you will be able to do so. I also want to note that in Louisiana, there is already state law that prohibits the discardation of frozen embryos or of frozen fertilized eggs. This has already started. In Florida, there is a bill pending before the state legislature that would deem that a fertilized egg is a human being and provide for the opportunity for penalties to be put into judgment for those who would discard those fertilized eggs. So this is a real threat today. With that, I'd like to yield to my colleague from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Nevada.
First of all, I want to start off by thanking my colleague, Senator Duckworth, for not only sharing her story of her wonderful family and beautiful 2 daughters who I've seen myself what an incredible mother she has, and they're fantastic girls. I also have to thank her for bringing forward this important legislation. You know, women across the country use IVF to start and grow their families. You're hearing that not only from Senator Duckworth, I've heard it from so many people in Nevada and really across the country. They make that choice in consultation with their partners, their families, and their doctors, not a government official, not a government official. There is no logical reason to deny women that right. And yet, after Roe versus Wade fell, we could see from a mile away that IVF was in danger. Senator Duckworth was one of the first to come forward and recognizing that, and that's why her legislation is so important. Why? Because attacking IVF was yet another chance for anti-choice Republicans to erode women's rights in this country. They've introduced a federal abortion ban that would supersede state laws. They've stacked the courts with anti-choice judges. They've limited funding to women's health care. And they have repeatedly ignored the very science behind reproductive health care in order to push their agenda. We knew this was coming. In fact, we tried to do something about it a year ago. After Roe was overturned, not only did Senator Duckworth come to the floor with her legislation, we have introduced numerous legislation on this floor to protect women's rights. And every single time, unfortunately, one of our Republican colleagues comes forward to object without any explanation, but continuing to really erode women's rights in this country. And I have to say, these extreme GOP colleagues of ours claim to be pro-life. They claim to champion family planning, but really when it comes down to it, they don't support it. You just have to be in our communities and listen to the women and their families, and you understand that. The difference this time around is that the Alabama Supreme Court is actually calling their bluff. The threat to IVF is no longer this hypothetical. In response to the ruling, and I believe it's an extreme ruling from this judge, but in response to this ruling, some clinics in Alabama have halted IVF procedures. They've halted that. I have seen heartbreaking stories of Alabama families who are being forced to put their dreams of starting a family on hold. And I'm here to tell you it will not stop with Alabama. The consequences of this ruling, not only will it close some of those clinics in Alabama that we've heard about, it will have a chilling impact nationally. It's one thing to have the legislation that bans it outright, but the chilling impact is another barrier. And you don't have to be from a state like Nevada. It's a pro-choice state. Listen, if you are threatening women, if you're threatening their families, if you're threatening the doctors that want to help these women, that has a chilling effect even in Nevada. Even in Nevada. These extreme GOP politicians are seeing this, you know, quite frankly, and I'm watching them, and they're suddenly stuck. They have to decide whether to agree with this judge's anti-choice decision or to concede that women should be allowed this basic right to choose if, when, and how to become a parent. Suddenly, they have to decide just how far they are willing to go in their crusade to control women. Having a child through IVF is a wonderful thing. It is not a crime, and it should not be punished. Our anti-choice Republican colleagues, they know this, yet they have once again refused to do the right thing for American families by supporting protections for accessing IVF. And let me just finally say, their hypocrisy is on full display. And America is watching. You don't have to believe me, just listen to the American public. Across this country, a majority, and I don't care if it's women I hear from, it's their loved ones, it's men, I don't care what party you are, I don't care if you're Democrat, you're Republican, you're nonpartisan, a majority of Americans want women to have this right to choose. They want them to have this ability. They believe in having families, they believe in IVF, they believe in women's reproductive rights. And most importantly, what some of our Republican colleagues are doing is inhibiting and limiting women's access to 21st century health care. That's what this is about. Why should we deny women the right to access 21st century health care? If it's going to save their lives, it's going to help them have families, what is wrong with that at the end of the day? So I have to thank Senator Duckworth, and it's unfortunate that we had an objection to her legislation that is so needed, unfortunately, in this day and age, but it is. That's where we are today, fighting for women's rights, fighting across this country. And finally, my only other question to my colleagues is, I trust women to make this decision. Why don't they? Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Thank you for holding today's important hearing. As a senator whose dream of becoming a mother was made possible through the miracle that is IVF, I am uniquely situated to remind this committee of a basic principle. We can recognize the value of potential human life, acknowledge that fertilized eggs are incredibly precious and valuable, and we can also accept the fact that an embryo is not yet a human being. No one, and I mean no one, better understands the hopes and dreams that viable embryos represent than an IVF patient struggling with infertility. No one better understands the pure, unmitigated joy that flows when a successful transfer of embryos results in pregnancy. And sadly, for us women who have lived through the soul-crushing, bone-deep agony of having that hope destroyed after completing unsuccessful rounds of IVF or of suffering a miscarriage, we experience in the most painful manner possible the fundamental reality that while every fertilized egg is unbelievably precious, unfortunately, not all will become a living, breathing child whose laughter and joy will fill our hearts and enrich our lives. Federal law wisely reflects this fact by defining the terms person, human being, child, and individual to only include, and I quote, every infant member of the species Homo sapiens who is born alive at any stage of development, end quote. Section 8 of Title I of the United States Code is consistent with Ranking Member Graham's common sense observation that, and I quote, nobody's ever been born in a freezer, end quote. Attempting to deny this reality, attempting to rewrite state constitutions and laws to define a fertilized egg as a human child, which is what the embryonic personhood crusade achieved in Alabama, is an affront to the millions of aspiring parents who struggle to conceive. It's a threat to the special separation of church and state. It's a betrayal of our great American spirit that reveres scientific discovery and progress. Those seeking to ban IVF won't stop at one medical procedure. Their ultimate mission is to extinguish the legacy of American ingenuity that was born in the experiments of Benjamin Franklin and continued through the groundbreaking IVF conception and birth of Elizabeth Carr in December of 1981. Look, every American has the right to personally believe that an embryo is a human child and to live their life in accordance with such beliefs by refusing to receive, provide, or offer IVF services, just as every American should have the right to decide whether, when, and how to build their family. But Congress must draw a line against a personhood movement's abuse of government power to force every American to live their life in accordance with that movement's moral beliefs. Opponents of IVF are being dishonest in claiming that the Alabama Supreme Court never banned IVF. Defining the cluster of cells that comprise an embryo to be a human being, and even the single cell that is fertilized prior to it becoming an embryo, they're defining that as an extrauterine child entitled to all the legal rights and protections of a person. This may not be an explicit IVF ban, but make no sense. As we witnessed in Alabama, it's an awfully effective way to ban IVF. After all, Alabama's criminal code defines murder as intentionally causing the death of a person. And just like that, 1 + 1 = 2. When Alabama defined a fertilized egg to be a person, and their code defines murder as intentionally causing the death of a person, the intentional disposal of an embryo, even a non-viable one that could cause a miscarriage if you were to implant it, which is a common practice in IVF, that disposal became a Class A felony. The flawed solution to Alabama Republicans crafted to restore IVF validates this fact by branding women and doctors that receive or provide IVF as de facto criminals in need of broad criminal and civil immunity simply because they require medical help to start a family. So let me say again, the law that was passed in Alabama does not negate the fact that the destruction of an embryo is the destruction of a human being. All that law that was recently signed into law says is that we're just not going to prosecute you. The chaos, confusion, and outrage in Alabama was a chilling preview of the dystopian future that awaits us if Congress fails to pass IVF protections that are effective and enforceable. That is why any senator that claims to support nationwide IVF protections should join me and the 48 senators co-sponsoring my bill in voting to pass the Access to Family Building Act. Our pro-family, pro-freedom bill would establish a nationwide right for patients to receive IVF. It would allow insurers to cover IVF, and it would also allow doctors to provide IVF in accordance with, and I make it clear that we state this in the bill, widely accepted and evidence-based medical standards of care. Unfortunately, there's a bad faith effort to confuse the public about my bill, using absurd hypotheticals that are an insult to families struggling with infertility. So let's be clear, under S 3612, no healthcare provider would be forced to provide IVF, period. That's because my bill's statutory definition of healthcare provider excludes providers that do not provide or seek to provide IVF. In addition, my bill only intends to protect IVF services provided in accordance with widely accepted and evidence-based medical standards of care. Wild-eyed hypotheticals like creating gene-edited designer babies, and I can't believe I have to say this, but it was brought up by my colleague who stood up to oppose my move for unanimous consent to pass the bill. She said that my bill would actually allow for the creation of human-animal chimeras, such as half-human, half-horse hybrids. Neither are widely accepted or consistent with evidence-based medical standards of care for IVF. Thus, S 3612 would not protect such procedures. Bottom line, Congress has the power to prevent what happened to those families in Alabama from ever happening again. So let's come together and achieve that goal. Let's pass the Access to Family Building Act to enshrine in federal law the right to receive, provide, and cover IVF, so that more families like mine can hold their precious babies after all those long years of struggle of infertility and finally have that child that they've dreamt of for decades. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Senator Schumer and Senator Murray. Good afternoon, everyone. And look, action speaks louder than words. And tomorrow, the American people will finally have a chance to judge for themselves whether Senate Republicans are truly committed to supporting and protecting IVF. If they do, they will join us in passing the pro-family, pro-freedom, common sense bill I introduced with Senators Murray and Booker, the Right to IVF Act. By now, we've all witnessed a hypocrisy of Senate Republicans running to cable news stations proclaiming their love of IVF. Then, once they step away from the TV cameras, doing absolutely nothing to ensure that it remains legal nationwide or becomes more affordable for American families. No matter how hard they try to hide it, no matter how many tweets they send, the reality is that when it comes to women's health care, the GOP's casual cruelty cannot help but shine through. We saw this in February when they actually blocked passage of my legislation that would have simply established a right for all Americans to access assistive reproductive technologies, including IVF. Like arsonists opening a fire insurance business after they've set fires and that insurance doesn't actually cover fire damage, a couple of Republicans even proposed a messaging bill with the goal of misleading Americans into thinking that the GOP wants to protect IVF. In reality, of course, their legislation would do nothing to address the very tangible threat that IVF clinics and patients are facing right now. And judging by the fact that 92% of the Republican conference still is not co-sponsoring this sham of a bill, Senators Cruz and Britt succeeded in sending only one message, that Senate Democrats are the only caucus committed to protecting IVF. To me, one of the most offensive parts of all of this is that along the way, the GOP is treating the American people as if they aren't smart enough to see through this web of lies and deceit. As if Republicans' cravenness isn't obvious every time Donald Trump brags about stripping away women's rights. As if the GOP's trademark blend of misogyny and hypocrisy isn't clear every time they claim to be the party of decency in the morning, then bow down to kiss Trump's fool's gold ring in the afternoon. Look, I really hope Republicans prove me wrong this week by passing this bill. I hope that when we get to the floor tomorrow, they will surprise us, that they will show they actually give a damn about women in this country, that they will at long last turn their empty words into action and actually help us protect access to IVF. But after months of lies, it's on them to prove that to us. It's on them to make us truly believe that they care as much about defending women's health as they do about getting invites to Mar-a-Lago. It should be simple. My Republican colleagues, if you support IVF, support our Right to IVF Act. If you actually believe that every woman deserves to be able to be called mama without being called a criminal, then show it, not with sound bites on cable news, but with your vote tomorrow. And I come to the floor today to speak on the bill that recently failed, despite my colleagues' assertion that they support access to in vitro fertilization for all Americans. You know, this morning, I was able to pack my daughter's lunch boxes. It sounds mundane, I know, but when I spend just a second thinking about it, even that kind of everyday moment with my girls isn't mundane at all. It's a miracle, because after 10 years of struggling with infertility, after being wounded in combat, I was only able to have my two darling girls through the medical marvel that is in vitro fertilization. The only reason there are PB&Js for me to make for their lunch, the only reason there are teeny sneakers for me to Velcro clothes is because after I came home from war, I had the freedom to seek the health care I needed to make my dream of going from Tammy to mommy a reality. I was one of the lucky ones, because now that freedom to get reproductive care is at risk for millions of other women whose most desperate hope in the world is to have a little one of their own. Make no mistake, that isn't some future nightmare. This is our present reality. Countless women already had their IVF treatments interrupted this year after an Alabama State Supreme Court ruling painted women seeking fertility treatments as criminals. And in this perilous moment for our country, as we stare down November and all the uncertainties that come with it, there's no telling how many more will follow. Look, I doubt that Donald Trump even knows what the acronym IVF stands for, and half the time I wonder if he can even spell IVF. But despite the incoherent, delusional, and frankly embarrassing ramblings that came out of his mouth last week, the reality is that he is the reason that IVF is at risk in the first place. The Dobbs decision is what led us to today's nightmare, taking the power to decide how and when to start families from us women and handing it to politicians in state houses across the country. Donald Trump is the one who brags about taking down Roe. Donald Trump is the one who acts like that's something to be proud of. He's like a bank robber who steals cash out of the till and flees the scene and then still expects a reward for calling the police to report a crime. So while it may now be convenient for him to claim that his support of IVF is as huge as the made-up crowd sizes at his rallies, we know the truth. He is the reason that IVF is in danger. He is to blame. He and every other Republican who cares more about staying good with Trump than about doing good for the Americans they are supposed to be serving. Many, too many of those Republicans are in this very chamber. I know that because today marked the third time in the past 7 months that I've come to the floor begging my Republican colleagues to help me pass legislation I wrote that would protect every American's right to IVF, regardless of what state they live in. A bill that would ensure no doctor or hopeful mom could be criminalized for trying to start a family. One that would permit all health insurers to cover the treatments, and one that would require the federal health insurance plan to cover reproductive technologies, allowing our troops to preserve their sperm or eggs before deploying to a combat zone. When I tried to pass it in February, it took the junior Republican senator from Mississippi what seemed like not even one full Mississippi second to block its passage. Then, when I tried to pass it again in June, nearly every GOP member voted it down. Today, it was the same old cynical story as Republican after Republican voted no, no, no. And at this point, it's obvious. Despite whatever talking points they force through gritted teeth on cable news, when the rubber hits the road and the vote is called, Republicans would do anything to get out of actually passing legislation that would protect women's right to access reproductive health care. Women in this country have been through enough. What women don't need is a man who is found liable for sexual abuse controlling what we can or cannot do with our bodies. What we don't need are politicians who have sworn fealty to a convicted felon treating us like we're the ones who are criminals. It's tragic. Republicans only seem to care about protecting life when it supposedly consists of some cells in a medical lab freezer. But what about when that life is of fifth graders whose school day gets shattered by a man with an AR-15 who wants to turn their math class into a massacre? What about when that life is their neighbors who is yet one more woman to bleed out on the delivery table, as the maternal mortality crisis among women of color rages on. Well, then those same Republicans couldn't seem to care less about defending the sanctity of life. Listen, I'm sure that some of my colleagues will try to slink away from taking any accountability here. Per usual, they'll shout some ridiculous excuse like, this bill would allow for human-animal hybrids, as if anyone would ever believe that. And for the record, it would not. Well, to those folks, I say that this afternoon's vote was your chance to put your vote where your mouth is. It was your chance to prove that you believe that every woman in this country deserves the chance to be called mom without also being called a criminal. Instead, your true policy beliefs, your hypocrisy, your misogyny showed through. Look, I went to war to defend this nation's rights and freedoms. I did it because I believe so deeply in the importance of that mission. I wasn't asking my GOP colleagues to head into combat to show that they cared deeply too. I wasn't asking them to do anything hard at all, actually. All I was asking them to do was to simply support a bill that could have represented millions of women's only chance of starting families. All I was asking of them was to vote in a way that reflected the position they claimed to have when they were spouting talking points on Fox News. They couldn't even do that. So on behalf of every woman who has faced a heart-shattering struggle of infertility, all I can say to my Republican colleagues this afternoon is, shame on you. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I first want to thank our colleague, Senator Duckworth from Illinois, for her leadership. Anyone that sees the beautiful pictures of her two girls with their different personalities, both of whom would not be here without these procedures, would understand just once you see those kids, as we all know people in our families, with our friends, our neighbors, who literally their families are there because of this procedure, understand how disappointing this vote was. That's a Minnesota euphemism of what happened in just the last hour, where we only had two of our Republican colleagues, the same two who voted with us last time, who were willing to stand up for IVF. IVF is a miracle medical treatment for families who couldn't otherwise have children. Over the last 4 decades, 8 million babies have been born around the world thanks to IVF. Yet today, we are moving backwards. The right to IVF is under attack because 2 years ago, the Supreme Court decided to shred half a century of legal precedent and strip away women's right to make their own healthcare decisions. Now American women are at the mercy of a patchwork of state laws, as my colleague from Illinois just described, which governs their access to reproductive care, including fertility treatment. What happens in Minnesota now is way different than what happens in our neighboring states of South Dakota and North Dakota, where in fact women have crossed the border to get the kind of health care they need, instead of, as my colleague noted, as has happened in Oklahoma and other states, bleeding out in parking lots because they have no choice. We saw it happen, of course, when it comes to IVF in Alabama. Their February Supreme Court decision brought IVF procedures in the state to a halt, leaving more than 2 million women in that state without access to this treatment. Whatever happens legally, court cases and the like that change things, go back and forth, it really is all the same thing. All of this angst, all of this actual disastrous effect on women's rights could have been prevented. But instead, we have a group of people, which does not reflect where 70 to 80% of the American people are, who've decided that politicians should make these decisions about a women's health, that politicians should be the ones that are going to decide about IVF or are going to decide about whether or not people can get abortions or the kind of birth control that they want, or even have access to mifepristone. I used to think that the people who were opposing us on this wanted to bring us back to the 1950s, but now it looks like it's 1850s. The people of this country deserve better. I'm thinking of Maida, a woman from Minnesota who became a mom thanks to IVF. In her own words, "I am the proud mother of twin girls, but without IVF, and my ability to access treatment, they would not be here today. Our twins are almost 8 years old, and I cannot imagine my life without them. They are incredible humans who are already bringing so much love, joy, and hope into this world. Every parent deserves that hope. No court, no politician should interfere with that hope. But right now, that hope is under attack. And today, many of my colleagues chose to deny that hope to women across the country. In doing so, they are working against the will of 86% of Americans who believe IVF should be protected and legal. Attacks on reproductive freedom and freedom in general, that's not what today should be about. I refuse to settle for a reality in which my daughter has fewer rights than I do or her grandmother did. And I will never stop fighting for a future where women, and not politicians, are in charge of their own health care decisions. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen, member of the Appropriations Committee, and now Senator Duckworth, who's the sponsor of our IVF bill.
Thank you, Leader Schumer. In a few minutes, we're going to have this vote yet again to create a statutory right for Americans to access reproductive technologies. This is a chance for my colleagues across the aisle to put their vote where their mouths have been. They say they support IVF. Here you go. Vote on this. It's very simple. This bill simply says that if you want to access assistive reproductive technology, including IVF, you will have a right to do so. If you are a healthcare provider that wants to offer this technology, you have a right to do so. And if you are an insurance company that wants to cover it, you have the right to cover it. It also has a provision which I think is incredibly important, which is allowing our military men and women access to IVF. And in particular, it allows our military men and women prior to a deployment into a combat zone to preserve and freeze their genetic material so that should they come home with injuries that result in them becoming infertile, they will have already preserved the genetic material so that they can themselves start those beautiful families that they wanted after protecting our families for the rest of us. I think it is simple. I think that Donald Trump has the ability right now to let my Republican colleagues know it's time to vote to support this bill. After all, with a single tweet, he was able to kill the border security bill. He can send out a tweet right now and get all my Republican colleagues to vote for this. And for all of my Republican colleagues who claim to support IVF, here you go, vote on this. It is very simple. Americans want access to reproductive technologies. They should have the right to access it. And frankly, I don't want a convicted felon who has been accused of inappropriate behavior with women to be the guy to decide what to do with my life and to do with my body. Look, I went to war to defend this nation's rights and freedoms, and I did it because I deeply believe in the importance of the mission of defending America's rights and freedoms. I'm not asking Republicans to head into combat. All I'm saying is just vote on this. Simply support this bill that represents millions of women's only chance at starting families. Because no matter what you say about your support for IVF, unless you vote for this bill, you are going to allow all of the state by state by state by state pieces of legislation that block the ability to access IVF simply by defining a fertilized egg as a human being, which then prevents IVF from being carried out to continue to affect women's ability to start families. So my Republican colleagues, let's go to the floor. Let's vote.
Thank you, Tammy.
Will you hold my family? Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Leader Schumer. As you can see, this is my family, and my girls have very different personalities, as you can tell from the photo. And this morning, I got to pack their lunch boxes, and it sounds mundane, I know, getting up and packing your kid's lunchbox and going through the drop-off line at school. But when I spend just a second thinking about it, even that kind of everyday moment with my girls isn't really mundane at all. It's a miracle. Because after 10 years of struggling with infertility, after being wounded in combat, I was only able to have my girls through the miracle of IVF. The only reason there was PB&Js for me to make this morning, and the only reason there is tiny sneakers for me to Velcro, is because after I came home from war, I had the freedom to seek the health care I needed to make my dream of going from Tammy to Mommy a reality. But now, thanks to Donald Trump, that right to get reproductive care is at risk for millions of women across this great nation. Look, I doubt that Donald Trump even knows what the acronym IVF stands for. Heck, I'm not even sure half the time that he can spell IVF. But, you know, and despite the incoherent, delusional, and frankly embarrassing ramblings that came out of his mouth last week, he is the reason that IVF is at risk in the first place. He's like a bank robber who steals cash out of the till and flees the scene. Then he expects a reward for calling the police to report that there had been a crime. So while it may now be convenient for him to claim that his support of IVF is as huge as the made-up crowd sizes at his rallies, we know the truth. He is to blame. He and every other Republican who cares more about staying good with Trump than about doing good for the American people that they are supposedly serving. Women in this country have been through enough. What women don't need is a man who was found liable for sexual abuse, controlling what we can or cannot do with our bodies. What we don't need are politicians who have sworn fealty to a convicted felon, treating us like we are the criminals. Listen, I'm sure that some of my Republican colleagues are going to run to the nearest camera to claim that their actions have simply been misunderstood. Well, to those colleagues, I say that today's vote is your chance to put your vote where your mouth is, to prove that you believe that every woman in this country deserves the chance to be called mommy without also being called a criminal. Because look, when I went to war to defend this nation's rights and freedoms, I expected that those freedoms to remain when I returned. And I did it because I believe so deeply in the importance of that mission. I'm not asking Republicans to head into combat to show that they care deeply too. I'm not asking them to do anything difficult at all, really. All I'm asking of them is to simply support this bill that could represent millions of women's only chance of starting a family. All I'm asking of them is to vote in a way that reflects the position they claim to have when they're spouting talking points on cable news.